revenge attacks in war. There are many reasons to fight a war, ranging from lofty ideals such as patriotism or a sense of duty, to more mundane reasons such as acquiring wealth or resources. In some cases, the reason is a simple matter of revenge. Here's a few examples of when the primary motivator for fighting was retribution. Operation Neptune Spear. For almost a decade, the United States military and intelligence services scoured the planet for the whereabouts of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, mastermind of the 9/11 terror attacks. Their efforts would eventually pay off when in 2010, they would receive word of his location in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The task of finding and eliminating bin Laden wouldn't be easy. While he would likely be at the location, this was far from a guarantee. Furthermore, the compound was surrounded by a high wall topped with barbed wire and designed to provide a limited line of sight. With such an opportunity too great to pass up, President Barack Obama authorized Operation Neptune Spear. In January 2011, a mock-up of the compound was built in North Carolina. There, members of DevGru, short for Development Group, better known as SEAL Team 6, trained for their mission under the leadership of Vice Admiral William McRaven. The objective was simple: find and capture or kill Osama bin Laden. After months of training and follow-up intelligence gathering, on the evening of May 1st, 2011, Neptune Spear was launched. Two Black Hawk helicopters, modified for stealth, carried 23 SEALs, an interpreter, and a Belgian Malinois dog named Cairo from their base in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, to their destination, the bin Laden compound. The entire operation would be monitored by drone, with feeds sent to McRaven in Jalalabad and President Obama and select advisors in Washington, D.C. On May 2nd, around 12:30 local time, when they approached their target, the mission ran into trouble. One of the helicopters clipped the wall of the compound, crashing to the ground. Though there were no casualties, the other helicopter landed outside the compound, securing the perimeter. McRaven ordered a CH-47 Chinook as a backup to be sent immediately, while the rest of the operation continued. The power to the area had been cut, and the SEALs utilized night vision goggles to infiltrate the compound. A detachment was sent to a secondary building where they prepared to blow open the door when they received fire. They returned fire, killing bin Laden's courier Abu Ahmad al-Kuwaiti. At the main building, the SEALs made their way to the second floor, where they killed another courier before making their way to the third floor. A tall, bearded man leaned out of a doorway, and a SEAL shot at him, missing him, forcing him back into the room. A pair of SEALs followed and burst in. They were immediately confronted by two screaming women, and the point man tackled them out of the way. The second SEAL entered the room. Seeing the man holding a woman as a shield, he took aim and fired, hitting the man above the eye. While this was happening, the other SEALs were making their way through the compound, eliminating any resistance and taking anything that could be of potential intelligence value, such as cell phones, computers, and paperwork. In the middle of the operation, the SEAL leader on the ground needed to speak to McRaven. With the admiral on the line, the SEAL stated, quote, "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo." With this phrase, it was confirmed Osama bin Laden was dead. Before celebrating, the SEALs would have to be evacuated. They made their way outside, hauling the materials they had gathered, as well as the body of bin Laden. They would load up on the arriving Chinook and head back to Afghanistan. Tests would confirm that the man killed was in fact Osama bin Laden, who was buried at sea instead of on land, to avoid having his grave being used as a pilgrimage for his followers. In total, 4 of bin Laden's entourage were killed in the fighting, in addition to bin Laden himself. No Americans were casualties during the raid, which lasted about 40 minutes. With his death, the largest manhunt in American history came to a close, and the most devastating terrorist attack ever in U.S. history was avenged. Operation Vengeance. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, as well as other installations throughout the Pacific. In response, the United States declared war on the Japanese Empire, the entire subsequent war effort focusing on vengeance for the lives lost that day. In addition, the United States launched numerous retribution attempts at more specific targets, most famously the Doolittle raid over Tokyo. Eventually, an opportunity fell into American hands, which made the possibility of revenge much more personal. On April 14, 1943, American naval intelligence intercepted a message from the Japanese Navy. American codebreakers, working under a project called Magic, began deciphering the message. After a few hours, the contents were revealed, and an opportunity that almost seemed too good to be true transpired. The message was an itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the main architect of the Pearl Harbor raid, who was in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, inspecting Japanese forces in the region. As part of his travel plans, Yamamoto would leave from Rabaul to an airfield on Bhalla, near the island of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. In addition to the route, the message also detailed the time he would depart from Rabaul, as well as the type and number of aircraft that would accompany him on the journey. Yamamoto would be flying in one of a pair of Mitsubishi G4M bombers, nicknamed Bheda by the Allies, and they would be escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters. The information was passed along to high-ranking officers in the U.S. military and the government, who authorized a strike on Yamamoto as revenge for Pearl Harbor. In order to prevent detection by the Japanese radar and aerial patrols, the aircraft assigned to Operation Vengeance would take off from Guadalcanal and then take a 600-mile circular route before intercepting the target, then making the 400-mile return trip. The Navy and Marine Corps F-4F Wildcats and F-4U Corsairs didn't have the range needed for this type of long-range mission, so responsibility was turned over to the 339th Fighter Squadron, supplemented with pilots from other units with proven records in aerial combat, flying P-38G Lightnings, which were fitted with 2 external drop tanks. 4 planes from the 18-aircraft force would be a kill flight designated to target Yamamoto, while the remainder would provide cover, holding off any possible reinforcements that would arrive to assist the admiral. The pilots were told that the target was a high-value individual, but were not told that it was Admiral Yamamoto himself. On April 18th, the Lightnings made their way to the interception point, flying low over the water to avoid detection. Just after 9:30 a.m., the formation spotted their targets. Almost immediately, the Zeros intercepted the incoming Americans. There are differing accounts as to exactly what happened, but what is certain is that shortly after the dogfight began, 2 Lightnings caught the lead Bheda in their sights and cut loose with their 4 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons. As it fell from the sky, they turned their attention to the second bomber and shot it down as well. A dogfight ensued, though the Americans broke off as their fuel was running low. Regardless of the exact events, what is clear is that the lead bomber contained Admiral Yamamoto, whose body was recovered by the Japanese the next day. With his death, Japanese morale plummeted, and Americans celebrated the demise of the architect of the most devastating surprise attack in American military history. Operation El Dorado Canyon. By the 1980s, Libya, led by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism. Numerous terrorist attacks were perpetrated around the world, including bombings, hijackings, and assassinations. The final straw came on April 5, 1986, when the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin was bombed, killing 2 American soldiers as well as wounding over 200 other people. In response, President Ronald Reagan authorized a systematic strike against Libya, codenamed Operation El Dorado Canyon. In the months preceding the operation, officers in the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing had already developed over 30 potential plans for strikes against Libyan targets. Most of these involved flying from their base in Britain across French and Italian airspace before hitting Libyan targets. Unfortunately, these countries didn't permit the use of their territory for the strikes, so an alternative was devised. The strike craft, 24 Air Force F-111 Aardvarks, would fly around Europe and then navigate their way through the narrow corridor of the Strait of Gibraltar before maneuvering towards targets in Libya. The planned 6,400-mile trip would take up to 13 hours and require multiple in-flight refuelings. EF-111A Raven electronic warfare planes would also support the operation, providing countermeasures against Libyan air defenses. In addition, more aircraft from the carriers USS Coral Sea and USS America would add their own aircraft to the assault. The carriers would launch 14 A-6E Intruders, which were supported by FA-18 Hornets and A-70 Corsairs. The whole operation would be supported by F-14 Tomcats. The aircraft would be refueled by KC-10 tankers who flew in formation with the fighters, and surveillance would be provided by E-2C Hawkeyes. Shortly after midnight on April 15th, the aircraft converged on their targets. At around 1:54 a.m. local time, the Ravens and Hornets began electronic attacks attacks against Libyan air defenses. Minutes later, the main attack began. The Bab al-Azizia barracks complex in Tripoli was hit by 3 F-111s with 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs. 6 more planes were part of the force sent to this target, but they didn't drop their bombs due to the rules of engagement, meant to avoid civilian casualties as well as mechanical failures. 3 more did the same to a nearby terrorist training camp. A flight of 5 F-111s then hit the Tripoli military airfield, destroying several aircraft with 500-pound bombs. At the same time in Benghazi, A-6 intruders struck the Jamahiriya guard barracks with their own 500-pound bombs, while others dropped their ordnance on the Benina airfield, which destroyed aircraft and helicopters. With their payloads expended, the aircraft returned to their respective air bases. All the naval craft landed, though one of the Air Force's F-111s was shot down. The 2-man crew later confirmed dead. The Libyans suffered between 37 and 60 killed and 93 injured. The locations that were struck suffered immense structural damage, and the Libyan capacity for organizing terrorist operations was greatly diminished, though not destroyed. Overall, while the mission was a success in that it achieved its objectives, Libya was still a major state sponsor of terrorism, and the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, was a direct retaliation for El Dorado Canyon, continuing the cycle of terror and violence. Operation Nemesis. During the early part of the 20th century, around 2.5 million Armenians lived within the Ottoman Empire, and as an ethnic minority were often subject to persecution. When the First World War broke out, the Ottomans sided with the Central Powers, consisting of the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, though there were many causes that eventually led to the Armenian genocide. The final catalyst was the Battle of Sarikamish, where the Russians decisively defeated the Ottomans. The Young Turks, the coalition that ran the Ottoman Empire, used the Armenians as a scapegoat for the disaster and began a policy of systematically removing them and other Christian groups from Asia Minor. Armenian soldiers would be disarmed and transferred to labor battalions where they would be worked to death. Villages along the Russian border would be exterminated without provocation, and any resistance was used as an excuse for further attacks. The Armenian population would be deported to Syria, being forced to walk the distance. Any who fell behind or attempted to flee would be killed. Once in the concentration camps in Syria, the detainees faced horrid conditions, and many died from hunger, thirst, or exposure to the harsh weather, and many were indiscriminately executed. During this persecution and deportation, between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians, as well as others, were killed. After the war, trials were held in response to the atrocities committed, and several of its leading protagonists were found guilty in their absence, having fled the country after the Ottoman defeat, while others were held captive by the British authorities. These men would later be exchanged for British prisoners held by the Ottomans, and most would flee abroad. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation, a group that sought a politically free Armenia, wanted revenge for those responsible. The resulting plan, named Operation Nemesis, after the Greek goddess of retribution, included a list of Ottoman officials that would be assassinated. At the top of the list was Talat Pasha, the leading architect of the Armenian genocide. On March 15, 1921, Talat was living in Berlin and had just left his apartment when he was spotted by Armenian nationalist Soghomon Tehlirian. Jogging across the street, he turned back to make sure he had the right person. Once certain, he passed by Talat and, drawing a pistol, placed the muzzle against his neck, then squeezed the trigger. A crowd of bystanders quickly apprehended Tehlirian, who was placed on trial for murder, though he would eventually be acquitted. While this is the most famous of the assassinations, there were many others on Operation Nemesis's target list. Khan Javanshir was gunned down in Constantinople whilst returning to his hotel after visiting the theater. Saeed Halim Pasha was killed in Rome as he stepped down from a coach. Behedin Shakir and Jamal Azmi were gunned down in Berlin as they casually walked through the city. Jamal Pasha and his 2 bodyguards were killed in Tiflis, Georgia, under a hail of bullets. In addition to these high-ranking officials, Operation Nemesis also assassinated other targets of lower priority, such as Armenian collaborators. For the most part, the assassins were either acquitted of the murders when they faced trial, or were able to escape, though one was captured by the Soviet Union and sent to a gulag, where there was no record of his eventual fate. Mariya Oktyabrskaya. During the Second World War, Soviet women served in the Red Army, not only in rear echelon roles like in other militaries, but also on the front lines. Most famously, the bomber plane Night Witch's crews gained renown for their flying exploits, but Soviet women also fought as snipers, tank crews, and a host of other combat duties. Most were motivated by patriotism or a sense of duty, but for one, the motivation to fight was retribution. Mariya Vasilyevna was born in what is now Ukraine in 1905. One of 10 children, she would eventually gain employment at a cannery and later as a telephone operator. In 1925, she would marry Red Army officer Ilya Fedotovich Ryadnenko, and both would take the name Oktyabrskaya, meaning October, a reference for the October Revolution. After her wedding, she was fully invested in the Red Army and received training as a nurse. When the Germans initiated Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Mariya was evacuated to Siberia. While there, she received word that Ilya had been killed in the intense fighting outside of Kiev. Instead of falling into grief, Mariya became enraged and presented herself to the nearest recruiting station. She was turned down, undeterred. She then sold almost all of her possessions and sent the money to the Soviet Defense Fund to pay for a tank, which was quickly followed up by a letter sent to the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin himself, which stated bluntly, quote, "I want revenge on the fascist dogs for his death and for the death of Soviet people tortured by the fascist barbarians," end quote. Seeing the possible propaganda use for her service, Stalin approved her request, and soon Mariya was sent on a 5-month training program for tank drivers. After graduating as a driver and a mechanic, she was allocated a tank, a T-34, which she named Boyovaya Podruga, or Fighting Girlfriend, and along with the rest of her crew, went off to war. Her first trial by fire was in 1943. As part of the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, 2nd Guards Tank Corps, the Fighting Girlfriend engaged the enemy near Vitebsk in Belarus. She and the rest of her crew managed to destroy several machine gun nests and artillery pieces. In a letter sent to her sister, Mariya stated, quote, "I've had my baptism by fire. Sometimes I'm so angry I can't even breathe," end quote. A month later, the Fighting Girlfriend's tracks were damaged, and while under fire, Mariya and another crew member repaired the damage while being covered by the tank's machine guns. On January 17, 1944, she would once again find herself in combat. Charging into German lines, Oktyabrskaya and her crew destroyed machine gun nests and reportedly eliminated a self-propelled gun. Once again, the tracks of the tank were damaged, and disregarding orders from her commander, Mariya leapt from the tank to repair the damage. While working, shell fragments struck her in the head, entering her brain from her left eye. She would be evacuated, lingering for 2 months in a hospital until passing away on March 15th. She would be buried at the Heroes of Remembrance Gardens at Smolensk. For her service, Mariya Oktyabrskaya would be posthumously recognized as Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest award given to Soviet soldiers. The rest of her crew continued to fight, and when the original Fighting Girlfriend was destroyed, it would rechristen subsequent tanks with the same name, in honor of their comrade in arms. Throughout history, military operations have been waged for a variety of reasons, including acquiring wealth and power, ideological purposes, and many others. Still, one of the most powerful reasons is the human desire for retribution against an enemy. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Ognjen, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.